Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Veronica, Willeto, DeCrane, Yanashia, Wansana Nishle, Nakirina, Bashichin, Twitch ini Dashanale, Skatnasani Dashache. Tej ish bitwata nasha do Billings, Montana da keshte. Kut ego da na asanishle. Hello, I'm Veronica Willeto DeCrane. I'm of the Minihogans clan and born for the Mexican clan. My paternal grandfather is of the Bitterwater clan, and my paternal grandmother is of the Tingo clan. And I grew up in Ajo Encino, New Mexico on the Navajo Nation, and I now live in Billings, Montana, and I am with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I have the honor and the privilege of being a project director for our work with the Tribal Youth Resource Center. And I am joined here today with Shannon, my colleague, so I will go ahead and pass it over to her.
Thanks, Veronica. Anin indue maganak nakijnaka wabagonis gichigami Ojibwe Ikwe Dodam Makwa. So good afternoon. I'm greeting you as my relatives. I'm Ojibwe and Irish. I live on the shores of Lake Superior in northern Minnesota. And I too have the honor of being able to work for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Native Child Trauma Center. And as such, get to work with Veronica, and I'm really glad to be able to be here with you today and talk a little bit about the resource parent curriculum and why it's here and how you might be thinking about utilizing it, the information that we have to share today. So thanks. Turn it back to you, Veronica.
Yeah, so today's session is, as Shannon shared, about the curriculum resource called the Resource Parent Curriculum. And so we are going to be giving an overview of that resource and then giving you a sneak peek into some of the content that it has. So we'll be talking mainly today about the invisible suitcase, and we will also touch on the cognitive triangle. So next slide. Before moving forward, we do have a disclaimer on the screen. So this project was supported by a grant that was awarded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And so the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed are those of the authors and don't necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Next slide. So before we move forward, I would also like to just share a little bit about who's all working together to provide you this learning experience today. As we mentioned, we're from the National Native Children's Trauma Center, and this is an event that is funded by OJJDP, that is brought to you by the Tribal Youth Resource Center. And then a sister TTA center to the Tribal Youth Resource Center is a resource basket. So they serve our relatives in Alaska. And so, and the Tribal Youth Resource Center is administered by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. So these are all of the entities that are working in partnership to bring you this information today. Next slide. So a little bit about us at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. We are a training and technical assistance center that focuses on adapting resources for trauma treatment and intervention. And we focus on American Indian and Alaskan Native peoples. And so we will be using a curriculum today from one of our partners, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. We are part of this national network of trauma centers And as part of this network, we're a Category 2 site that provides TTA services. There are others in a network that provide direct services that are Category 3 sites, and this network is funded by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. So because we're part of this network, we get to use some amazing resources that are developed, and so and we work to adapt them to the tribal audiences that we serve. Next slide. So a little bit more on this network. They are working to raise the standard of care for children who have been impacted by trauma throughout the United States. And it's made up of over 200 sites. And I'm sure Shannon can tell you a little bit more about it because, as she said, she also has the honor of working for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. With that said, I will go ahead and pass it over to Shannon, and she will get us started with the content.
Hey, thanks, Veronica. Next slide, please. Just want to do a shout out to our to Antonio for being such a good slide mover for us today. So, so we really wanted to just talk about this, introducing this particular curriculum, and it's really caring for children who have experienced trauma, and it's a workshop for resource parents. So I just want to take a minute and talk about that term resource parent, because for many years we didn't hear that term. And there may be those of you on the call that are saying, well, what's a resource parent? A resource parent is a foster parent or kinship parenting or any other parenting that is not a biological parent, that is interacting and being in a caretaking role of a child. So I'm going to ask, just so we get to know a little bit about all of you that are tuning in today, to have Antonio, if you would put up the poll. We're just going to have a short poll, and just to get a sense of whether you're currently a resource parent or a foster parent, or you plan to be a resource parent, or if you're currently working with or you plan to work with resource parents. So we'll give you just a few seconds to fill this out. So just go ahead and answer the poll if you would, please. Antonio, I'm not seeing the results of the poll as they're coming in, so maybe that happens afterwards. Okay, great. Thank you. That's great. Okay, I think that's great. That gives us a sense. We've got quite a few of you that are planning on working with resource parents. And so I think that some of this will be helpful. Whatever perspective you're coming to the conversation with, you know, we're glad to have you involved in this conversation. So next slide, please. So why was a trauma workshop for resource parents even created? It really was because we know that when many children are in foster care, that they've lived through a traumatic experience. And there are those that would say the very fact that you are in a care center other than your original home means that you're going to have some trauma involved. And so knowing this and knowing kind of what was happening out there, that foster parents or kinship parents weren't equipped to really deal with what was going on with the children. And so children come into their homes and they have traumatic events that they bring with them, and it begins to affect their behavior and their relationships, and in really profound ways. And one of the things, next slide, please. So, one of the things that they were finding was that those people who were in those caretaking positions, those foster parents, were being affected with things like compassion fatigue, maybe their own painful memories, and secondary traumatization in dealing with these children. And probably the biggest reason is that as a result of these trauma effects, what we were finding is that foster parents were leaving the field and not doing any more fostering, or what really was impactful was looking at the amount of unsuccessful placement, so a disruption in placement. So if you have a child who's already traumatized, who's going into the system and going to be placed with a family other than their own, and then have that placement be disrupted because the families were ill-equipped, the child wasn't getting what the child needed, and now we've just compounded the trauma by all those multiple placements. So it was really a response to how do we interrupt that? How do we begin to share with families about what trauma was about, what they could expect, and how they might be able to really impact that outcome and have a successful placement. So next slide, please. So, so this was, kind of the challenge, was that when you're caring for children who have been through that trauma, it can really leave that resource parent feeling very confused, like, what's happening? I'm trying to help and it's not working. Frustrated about it, unappreciated. So you have a child who has been through a traumatic event, comes to your home, and you're really doing everything possible to not be not be in a position to do anything but help, and you're unappreciated by the child or by the system, and you end up angry and feeling helpless in order to be able to really help that child. So next slide, please. So the idea was that when you understand where that trauma is and how it's affected the child that you're parenting, it becomes easier. It becomes easier to communicate with the child. It becomes easier to improve your child's behavior and attitudes, being able to identify and get your child the help that he or she needs, and reducing the risk of your own compassion fatigue or that secondary trauma. It really is about, once you can understand that the trauma isn't about you, but it's about what that child is bringing with them into that relationship. And in some ways it is about you, because you bring your own experiences with you as well. So next slide, please. So when we talk about what are the kind of essential components of trauma-informed parenting, we talk about just recognizing what that impact of that trauma has on your child. And we do a lot of skill building within the resource curriculum, so that you have an opportunity to begin to identify some things, to be able to create safe space. What does that mean? What does that mean for that particular child? And so we get into some of these things about those elements in the trauma-informed parenting. And to be able to help the child, depending upon, what is age appropriate, to be able to manage those emotions, and to be able to deal with those behaviors. So all of these essential elements for that trauma-informed parenting are embedded into the curriculum. And you see that the number 9 is take care of yourself. If I was writing this list, I'd tell you right now that I would rearrange the numbers. These are not, chronological in any sense, but I would actually visually take care of yourself to be foundational in the process. So next slide. So what we're going to talk about, and Veronica mentioned it, was we're just going to pull out a couple of the main focuses of this curriculum. But you'll see that the curriculum is made up of 7 modules, introductions, everybody's getting to know each other, their purposes, why they're there, but basically then moving into the trauma 101. What is trauma? How does it happen? What does it look like? What are all the different elements that could be involved in trauma? And then what we're going to talk about a little bit today is, understanding the effects of that trauma. How does it show up? And what creates the conditions under which it shows up. And then module 4 is building a safe space, a safe place. And then Veronica is going to talk a little bit about dealing with the feelings and behaviors. She talked about cognitive behavioral therapy and looking at what consists of that in being able to really deal with those feelings and behaviors when they show up. And then module 6 is connections and healings. And then module 7 is really about becoming an advocate. So this resource parent curriculum workshop is meant to be over time. It's not, it's not a one-day training. It really is, all of these modules are usually taken and over time and building upon each other. So next slide, please. Oh, of course, we have the module 8, which is taking care of yourself. Again, I also often wonder about the messaging when we put taking care of yourself at the end. Many times you'll be at workshops or you'll be at different events and they do everything they're supposed to and then they take care of yourself. And we got that message early on for ourselves about work first, play later. And somehow we equate taking care of ourselves with play. And so you can imagine how when you place that at the last thing, it's usually the thing that gets dropped off. And so helping to think more deeply about the foundational importance of taking care of oneself and being able to build resilience and be able to be, especially in situations where you're going to be parenting a child who has a traumatic experience or traumatic experiences that they're living with. So when we kind of start with this whole idea of what actually happens when someone has a traumatic experience, and we really talk about that internal alarm system, and we give people, there's a great little scenario. I don't think this picture depicts it very well, but the scenario is if you can just imagine that you're in, maybe you're on a path, you're walking down a path and all of a sudden there's a snake in the middle of the path. And you're really scared of snakes. And it startles you because it comes out, from the side of the woods or whatever, and it's right in the middle of your path. And what happens immediately when you're in fear is that your brain takes over, right? The chemicals, maybe the first thing you notice is catch your breath. So now your breath is involved because you're startled. And you, depending upon your fear level, you might run if you're afraid of snakes, or you might just be so petrified that you freeze in place. Or you might look around to see if there's something that you can use as a weapon to, to fight that snake or to get that snake away from you. So all those things happen, right? And that's traumatic in the moment. But what happens if the threat is removed, everything it goes back to normal and you're okay, settle down, everything happens. You're in great shape, right? Next slide, please. Yeah, the issue is that sometimes that thermometer, that fear goes up and it doesn't go down again, or something else happens that reinforces it. So it ends up staying on red alert. So let's go back to being in the woods and or on the path rather. And you go on the path the next day and but you're already kind of on alert, right? You're kind of looking around because of the experience you had with the snake the day before. But now today, you're walking down the path and you see something in the path, and immediately, before you even recognize what that is, maybe it's kind of a little bit the same shape, or immediately what happens is your heart rate goes up. Maybe your breathing starts to go faster. And as you get closer, you realize that it's not a snake. Next slide, please. Even though you've realized it's not a snake, your body has already reacted to that stick in the road as if it is a snake. And this is what happens with trauma, is that our brains remember and our bodies react to that immediately. So it doesn't matter that it's not a snake, that it's a stick. You still have already experienced increased heart rate, maybe some reactions in terms of fight, flight, or freeze. All of that is happening. So, and it really happens because of the way that our brain operates. Our brain operates, it really develops from the bottom up. I love it when somebody kind of sometimes uses a fist to say, okay, if this was your brain, here down at the bottom, that's what starts first. And that's that basic, primitive survival mode. It's what they call your, your primitive brain, part of your brain, your dinosaur brain, your whatever that really reacts. It's like, okay, I need to do this. It's responsible for our own self-preservation. And that's where all of that kicks in terms of fight, flight, freeze. And then as our brains develop, then it gets all the way up to the more complex, the frontal lobe, which is more the complex rational thought, planning, thinking things through. But as our brains react, like it takes a while to get from back down here to that, what I would call our primitive brain, all the way up to our abstract thinking. So I've seen something and I haven't even got to the point, it takes a little while to get to the point to say, oh, that is not a snake. That's a stick and it's not going to hurt me and I'm okay. Next slide, please. So the other thing that happens in the brain is that the brain is constantly developing connections. And those are critical as we look at brain development. And so we know from the things that we've learned along the way that if we isolate those connections, if we don't allow those connections to happen or something interrupts those connections, that really affects brain development. So even the connections, the experiments they did separating baby monkeys from their mothers and not getting that nurturing that they needed, and what happened to their brains in the process. It really had to do with that critical nature that we have for these connections and what our brain requires. And so I think there's one more thing that we talk about in terms of those interactions with, not just with caregivers, but all of those connections get cemented. So the more that, and by that I mean, it's like habits, like when we have a habit, right? That the stronger the habit, the more you repeat something, the more stronger that those connections get. And it's why when you're trying to break a habit or create a new habit, it takes so much effort. Because once something is in that connection is made and it's repeated over and over again, it becomes very, very strong. And it's the reason why if you're going to create a new habit, they say you can do that. You can create new neurons to create new habits. But it takes consistently doing something over a significant period of time in order to create a new neural pathway. So next slide. Oh, well, here it's talking about this right here is the more experiences repeated, the more the stronger those connections become. So next slide, please. So what happens is that when somebody experiences trauma, it causes the brain to develop in a different way. And it's really meant for survival. You know, the child is surviving in a dangerous world. It's on that constant alert for danger. They're quick to read threats or not even reading the threat. Remember how long it takes to get from that bottom of the brain all the way to the top of the brain to really not ignite that fight, flight, or freeze. So all of this is happening, and we see it show up, right? We see the person who is, or maybe it's even ourselves that is on constant alert, high alert, something that's happened that, maybe it only happened once, maybe it happened more than once, but even if it only happened once, we're still anticipating that kind of, that there may be danger. So hyper alert, looking around for that means that your stress hormones are being produced at a higher rate. And that, of course, has more opportunity to interfere with the development of that higher brain function. And now we're learning, of course, that what other kinds of health tolls that stress hormones actually make on our bodies. So next slide, please. So how does it, what might this look like, right? So if we're looking at young children, it might be that sensitivity to noise, avoidance of any kind of contact, being confused about what's going on or who to go to or who's dangerous or who's safe, not even knowing those things, shows up in a lack of attachment to the primary caregiver or being separated from people that are familiar. And some of that, it's all a matter of degree. How is it interfering with the functioning of your family or the child themselves? So next slide, please. And of course, at different ages, it's going to show up differently, right? We'll look at those school age. It might be emotional swings. You might see some learning problems, fears and anxieties, all of these things. And you as a foster parent or resource parent are dealing with all of these kinds of manifestations of those trauma impacts. Next slide, please. Again, we're seeing, it's how it shows up a little bit differently in terms of age and what you might see. So you have a young person who can't really plan into the future, takes a lot of risks. I mean, some of that, and again, it's a matter of degree to being able to see how that's playing out in that child's life, right? Because we expect a degree of risk taking in this age group. We expect some of these things, but maybe not the inappropriate aggression. So it's really all of those things being assessed together. So next slide, please. So we know that those, you know, go back one, yeah. So we know that some of that developmental, you know, getting them back on track. This is why it's so important for foster parents or resource parents to really have this information, because there's specific things and skills that we can teach that really help communication skills, some opportunities to identify and respond differently, and to really be able to assist the child in being able to unlearn those unhealthy ways of being and rebuilding. And like I said, that takes time. So next slide, please. So we know that traumas, you know, is going to shape that child's belief and expectations about themselves, about the adults that care for them, and about the world in general. And so we spend in this curriculum, we spend a pretty significant time talking about this invisible suitcase. And we say invisible because many times when children are entering into care, we don't have all the information. Most times we don't have all the information. And even the information, even in what one might consider a well-documented case, right, where we know a lot, there are still things we don't know. And so thinking about what might be in that invisible suitcase and how that might affect the relationships, the relationship with the adults that are going to be caring for them, and about themselves. So next slide, please. So we're just going to spend just a couple moments to really think about an example of Maya. So Maya is only 8 years old, and she wakes up crying in the middle of the night. You know, she's just a baby. She's 8 months old. And when her Aunt Jenna, who is the caretaker, tries to soothe her, Maya arches her back, she pushes her hands against Jenna's shoulders, and she screams even harder. And she tries to make eye contact with Maya. And the baby turns her head away. And this little baby makes me feel completely rejected, Jenna says. And sometimes I feel so helpless, I just have to put her down and let her cry. So you might think that Maya is only 8 months old, you know, really how much can there be? I mean, she's got Jenna's who's trying to soothe her and being positive with her. You know, how can a 8-month-old actually have trauma? So next slide, please. But here's some of Maya's history. So she's been exposed to domestic violence. She's had her own physical abuse, including broken bones and bruises. She's been separated from her mother, and she has medical trauma, including a hospitalization. So you can see that she's had all of these things that she's coming in her suit. And these are things you might know that are in her suitcase. So next slide, please. So here's how it shows up, right? She cries and she screams. And if Aunt Jenna goes to pick her up and comfort her, she rejects that comfort. She's very easily startled and distressed by loud noises. She absolutely screams when she gets brought to the doctor's office, even before the doctor or the nurse has touched her. She's already in distress. And she does take comfort from her bottle when it's propped up rather than when it's being held. So those are some of Maya's behaviors, some of how that trauma shows up. Next slide, please. Oh, she is soothed by a particular piece of music that said. So, and people can come off, they can either put it in the chat or they can come off, their, and unmute. I just want to see if you're thinking about Maya's suitcase, what do you think are some of her beliefs about herself? And you can just unmute yourself. And what might some of Maya's beliefs about herself, even though she's young, what might those beliefs about herself be? Any ideas? What might some of the beliefs about herself be? Thanks, Yamel. She believes she's not loved or people are not positive for her, right? That's anybody else thinking about what you might? Pain and abuse is the norm, okay. She sees anyone around her as dangerous, yeah. Yeah, her beliefs might be that her beliefs might be that crying is scary. You know, when I cry, nobody responds to me. And when I cry, others may hit me or yell at me, right? Can't trust anyone. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah. Nobody to be trusted. Yeah. How might that be different? What might her beliefs be about her caregivers? And some of them I think are the same. You can't trust anyone, right? People are dangerous. But maybe it might be others cause me pain, right? Not comfort. And they're not safe. Can't be trusted, like Stephanie was saying. What about the world? What might be some of Maya's? She might be confused if some oh, right, Brianna. She might be very confused if some caregivers hurt her, but some don't. So how do you choose? How do you know, right? She's only 8 months old. Just operating out of that. The world isn't safe and she can't form attachments. Yeah. The world is not safe. Yeah. What about hospitals? I mean, hospitals must be really scary. If she'd been to a hospital when she was hurt. What might she might even have some thoughts, I think said in that last statement that, music was good. Music soothed her. That was good. The bottle soothed her, but not if somebody was holding the bottle. She may have some fear that others might hurt her. And yep, she's in survival mode, right? Yeah. So all of these things are beginning to already play out in her life because of the experience she had, even though she's so young. So we begin to see how important it is that we begin to unpack the suitcase. Right. Even smells. She may probably identify the smells in the hospital. If she had a bad experience or she went to the hospital and when she was injured in some way, and remember all those kinds of things that ignite those memories within her, even if it's not in a conscious level, right? Was there somebody else that wanted to say something? Okay. Next slide, please. So yeah, sounds, right, Stephanie? The sounds that you could even hear the sounds sometimes. You could be in a situation that that people just even hear the sounds. Could you go back one slide again? Yeah, so when we think about these we not only know what the suitcase, I always think it's almost like playing detective, hyper-vigilant all the time, part of the survival mode. Yes, everybody. Okay, next slide, please. So, these are the kinds of things that we unpack within the parent resource curriculum. And like I said, there's a lot more, it's a lot more extensive, but we want to give you a little flavor of the kinds of things that we'll be talking about, but not just about what's in the invisible suitcase that our child brings into the household, but what's within our own invisible suitcase and how that might come to play in the relationships that we have as a foster parent or a kinship care relationship. So, it's not all doom and gloom, because the fact is that there's a lot that we can do, and that's part of what this curriculum is about, is really to be able to look at the strengths that we have and how we can build upon those strengths to really assist ourselves, our child, and have a family that is functioning in a way that's healthy for everyone. So as a trauma-informed parent, we learn about how to offer that base of love and protection, and how to be available, and how to respond to your child's needs and give examples and help provide those opportunities to safely explore the world. And like I said, this is a snippet of one module. And I'm going to turn it over to Veronica now to talk a little bit about another module that's offered.
Thank you, Shannon. Next slide, please. So we're now going to dive into Module 5, which really is about dealing with feelings and behaviors. And so basically what's in a child's suitcase. So as a caregiver, you may be seeing the behaviors. They're very apparent to you. Maybe you can, these are behaviors that you can't ignore. And they could be very overwhelming. And sometimes that may be the reason why resource parents might be interested in a training like this, because they may have some difficult behaviors or be concerned about some of the behaviors that their children are expressing to them, that their children are exhibiting. And so, but what this module focuses on is what's beneath those behaviors. And as Shannon said, we're learning to be detectives. And so we are learning how to read those behaviors, what is underneath the surface. So like this picture shows us, the example of an iceberg and how we may only see the tip of what it is that they are carrying, what it is that they are going through. Beneath the surface, they may have these feelings, these thoughts. They may even have expectations of their caregivers, expectations of others that they see, expectations of the world. And they may also have these beliefs that we've been going over about themselves, about their caregivers, about the world. Next slide, please. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are going to your child's school. Let's say you have an older child and they have a PTA, and you decide that you're going to attend the PTA meeting. So you head to the school to attend that meeting. And you walk into the room and you notice that there are these two parents. You've met them before. You don't know them that well, but you've met them before, and they're on the other side of the room and they look your way. But then they continue talking to each other, and it seems like they don't really acknowledge you and they don't come over to you. So let me ask you guys, what would you think? What would be your first thought if that happened to you? So what would you think if you were in that situation? Okay, Sarah wants to hear the situation again. Okay, so you're going to your child's PTA meeting, or you're at your child's school, you're going to a PTA meeting, and you notice that there are two other parents in the room, and you know them, you've met them before, but you don't know them that well. And they're talking to each other, and they do notice you coming into the room. They look over at you, but then they return to their conversation, so they don't acknowledge you and they don't come over. So how would that, what would your thoughts be about that? What would be your first thought? So Shannon is saying that she would think her first thought would be that they're talking about her. Maybe someone might try not to take it personal. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they are being unpolite. They must be having a deep or important conversation. So we're giving ideas of our thoughts. So not take it personally. They must be having an important conversation. They must be deep in conversation and want to finish their conversation. Their conversation must be important, and I don't want to interrupt that. Maybe my child was rude to their child, so maybe they're talking about my child. All right, so the thought that you had, how would it make you feel? So Shannon gave the example of like, they're talking about me. How would that make you feel? If your thought was that they're busy, they have an important conversation, how would that make you feel? If your thought was that they're talking about my child, or my child might have done something to their child, how would that make you feel? Unwelcomed. Someone might feel odd. You would probably feel uncomfortable. Yeah, it would have been an uncomfortable situation. Yes. Awkward, you would feel awkward. Yes. So based on those feelings that you're having, what would you do? What action would you take? What would be your next action? I think we have some folks earlier who jumped to the action. And so they said that they would introduce themselves. So what would your next action be? Based on how you're feeling. So Stephanie's feeling like she wants to be invisible. What would you do? You would go over and join them in their conversation. Maybe just go and sit down. Maybe leave the room. Maybe you're like, this PTA meeting is not for me. Maybe leave for a little while, or just sit in silence with them if we felt like they were having an important conversation. Maybe sit down and scroll Facebook. Yes. So in this situation, there's an objective reality, but each of us might respond differently to that reality depending on how we think and about it, and how we've assessed that reality, and also how we feel about the situation. So next slide, please. Psychologists actually say that there's a relationship between what we think, what we feel, and what we do. And they refer to this as the cognitive triangle. So the thoughts that we have, they will affect how we feel, they will affect what we do, how we behave. And it's not just like a one-way thing. How we behave will affect how we feel. It'll affect our thoughts. So if you're thinking that the parents are being rude, that or maybe that they're talking about your child, or if you have some of those thoughts, maybe that will lead to some feelings of just not really feeling welcomed or not really feeling okay about the situation. And then that might lead to actions that maybe might be accurate actions. So like it might be true that they could be unwelcoming. It might be true that they could be talking about your child. But if they're not, then but you've already had that thought and those feelings, then sometimes we take these actions based on our thoughts and feelings, and they don't really match the situation. Next slide. So for children who have been impacted by trauma, it's actually really difficult for them sometimes to understand the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So like for some of us, we might be able to like recognize that maybe we're having a negative thought, and then we can replace that with maybe a more productive thought or a neutral thought. So maybe, for example, if we thought that, you know, they're talking about me or they're talking about my child, we might replace that thought with like something more neutral, like, oh, they're deep in their conversation, um, you know, and so it would be more of a neutral thought. And so that would disrupt that process that is happening where our negative thoughts can lead to negative emotions and behaviors. But for children who are struggling with trauma, they might struggle to see the connection between their thoughts and their feelings and behaviors. And because they struggle with that, it may be more difficult for them to interrupt that process. And oftentimes it's because with children who have experienced, especially very severe trauma, that it might have impacted their development and some of the developmental tasks that Shannon was speaking to earlier. And so because of that derailment of their development, they may not have been able to learn from their caregivers or learn at an earlier age some of these skills around the connection between our feelings, our thoughts, and behaviors. And then they might also just generally, because of their trauma history, struggle to express their emotions, and not only just express them, maybe they might be expressing them in ways that is harmful to others, or is not really appropriate in the situation, or beyond just expressing them, they may even just struggle to understand what their emotions are. Maybe they might have some mixed emotions. Maybe they might have, what it seems like they're feeling might be coming off as anger, but there might be some other types of emotions that they might actually be having, like frustration or disappointment, and it's coming out to us like anger. And so they might have a hard time understanding what their emotions really are. And then especially in situations like ambiguous situations, like the scenario that I posed to you all, sometimes there'll be a little bit of a struggle in reading other people's cues. So reading their facial expressions, their body expressions, and children with trauma history might misinterpret some of those cues. And then a lot of times children might have these reminders, like even that ambiguous situation might have reminded them of their trauma history, and that could have brought up thoughts and feelings that relate to that trauma history versus that interaction that they're having in the moment. And so for all of these reasons, children can have a hard time really being able to think about how their thoughts and their feelings lead to those behaviors. Next slide. And so some of the behaviors that we see is actually children who may have grown up in an environment or spent a lot of time in an environment where there were certain patterns and certain behaviors, certain relationships, maybe the adults that they spent a lot of time around may have had some negative thoughts that led to negative feelings and negative behaviors, and they were just accustomed to those patterns. And so they might show up in your home and they might be continuing those patterns, mostly because they're familiar. And sometimes they might have some behaviors because they're really trying to interact with you, even though that interaction might be negative, especially if they have an insecure attachment and they're really struggling to form good relationships with others, that they might be just trying to get some attention from you or have some interaction with you. Or they might be trying to keep you at bay. Some of their behaviors, the reasons for them might be just to keep you at a distance. And then we talked about that invisible suitcase. So all of these beliefs and thoughts that they have about themselves and about other people, they're just trying to prove that their suitcase is accurate, that what's in their suitcase is true about the world, is true about caregivers and adults, is true about themselves. And so part of their behaviors might be for this reason, and part of their behaviors might just be venting. There might be some, because of that, some of those developmental struggles, they might have not had an opportunity to really learn how to express their emotions or how to vent in a good way or in a way that doesn't harm anyone. And sometimes they might have very strong feelings that they just don't know what to do with or how to handle. And so it'll come out as venting. Next slide. So what do we do as caregivers when we have children who have some behaviors and we're trying to understand their behaviors and we're trying to support them in a loving way? So we're just going to go through a few things that we as caregivers can do to be helpful. And the first one is to differentiate ourselves from caregivers in their past that may not have been helpful to them or may have been the cause of some of their trauma. So part of their invisible suitcase may be that they believe that, like we had stated earlier, they believe that, caregivers are not to be trusted, they're not safe, they're unpredictable, they don't care about me. So those are some of the things that they might believe about their caregivers. And so our job is not to buy into that. We don't want to help them prove that those beliefs in their suitcase are true. We also want to avoid anger, and that can be really difficult, especially when some of those behaviors are very volatile and they really might hurt us, right? Not just emotionally, but also physically, they might really hurt us. So it can be difficult to not express anger, but when we are working on that, and part of it might just be to slow things down and to step away from that situation, and find a way where you're not reacting out of anger to them. And then we also shouldn't take their behavior at face value. So remembering that iceberg and remembering that there could be some thoughts and beliefs that are underneath the surface of that behavior that that we see. And then this is also another difficult one. That behavior can often feel like it's against us. When the baby is crying and we pick the baby up and the baby doesn't stop crying, we can take that personally. We can wonder if it's us. And so we can wonder if we're not doing something right. And so sometimes we take those behaviors personally. And so to differentiate ourselves from past caregivers, we can do the best we can to not take those behaviors personally, but understand that those behaviors might be happening with us, but they may not be even about us. They may be behaviors that just come automatically to them because they have no other way, they haven't learned other ways to deal with some of their thoughts and their feelings. And so it could just be like an automatic response that they have because they're in their survival brain, their dinosaur brain. And so so if when we don't take it personally, we have a better chance of reacting and supporting them in a way that is effective and helpful to them. Next slide. So I also want to share that another way we can help children with some of these behaviors is by tuning in. So we want to get to a place, the picture on the right side of the screen, where when the child is having a tantrum, is having an uncontrollable behavior, that we are just that person that is like that emotional container that just is around them and letting them know that they're safe, letting them know that we have that unconditional love for them. And so we want to get to that place. But before we get to that place, we have to really tune in to what it is that they are expressing. And the challenge is that it may be a little bit difficult to do that. We might have a hard time really trying to understand as we're investigating what it is that they're really feeling. So we'll just go over some things that might help us to tune in to children. Next slide. Okay, so the first one, when we're trying to help children identify feelings, we can actually help them do this by helping them with words. Words that can be describing how they're feeling. So maybe in that moment that a child is feeling out of control, we might say something like, I wonder if you're feeling really scared about this. So we might suggest a feeling that might be a word that might be a possible description of how they're feeling. Another thing we can do in that moment is maybe acknowledge and validate how the child feels. So once they're able to describe how they're feeling or we're able to understand what those feelings are, that we can take a moment to just let the child know that it's okay that they're feeling that way. And even though the child and you as the caregiver may not agree, like you might not have the same feelings about that that situation that child is upset about, that you can say it's okay that we don't have the same feelings, and it's okay that you may be scared, and that's okay to feel that. So that can have a really powerful impact on children because in their past experiences, they might have received messages from their caregivers that how they were feeling was not okay. And they might have been even directed by their caregivers that they needed to change how they felt, or they needed to feel a different way. So really having that validation feels very encouraging and feels very disarming for them, to where they might not feel the need to really, it might help to kind of cool them down a little bit. And then just acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. I think sometimes we as parents, we struggle with this, right? We might see that child's behaviors or even how they're feeling as like an overreaction. And so we have to really be careful, because for that child, at their developmental level that they're at, whether it's their age or whatever developmental level that they're at that point, for them, it's a very serious thing, right? For them, they're actually dealing with some of these trauma reminders and trauma reactions, and they're trying to learn how to handle them. So it's a very serious situation for them. So for us as adults to minimize how they feel, or how serious they are taking, taking the situation, really doesn't help them, and actually might confuse them or make the situation worse, right? Next slide. And sometimes when they get to a point where they're comfortable telling you how they feel about things, they might actually reveal to you some trauma. Maybe this is trauma that you know already, right? It's maybe it's well documented, or maybe it's a new trauma experience that you weren't aware of. But when they do reveal those things to you, it's important to stay calm and to be supportive and to be more matter of fact. So not, whenever we elevate our emotions and elevate our reactions, they will also elevate as well. And so it's important to remain calm, to remain matter of fact when we hear those things. And then the other thing is to be sensitive to cultural differences, even if you feel like the child is coming from the same culture as you. When they enter your home might be a new culture to them. And so there might be some cultural differences between like how things are expressed, or how emotions are handled, or how emotions are talked about or seen, how they're described. There might be even just interpretations of situations that there might be some differences there. So it would be like, if you can imagine, you're going to a wedding, and there's people from all walks of life at that wedding, and it's a very emotional time. And when you're there at that wedding and you see, so you see people, some people might run to you and hug you and just like be so happy to see you. And then some people might be like a little bit more like, not wanting to have that touch, maybe they might just want to shake your hand, or they might, be a little bit more reluctant to just like dive right into that situation of that wedding, and they're still trying to adjust to that environment. So people are different, right? Some people want their spaces, their bubbles to be respected. So we're all kind of different in terms of just our culture and just how we are personally and individually. So just be mindful of that too, as you're trying to tune into your child's emotions and to their behaviors. And then the last one, of course, is to be reassuring. There might be a pattern in a child's life where they felt like adults couldn't be trusted, they couldn't be depended on. And so we want to be reassuring to them that you're there to help, but also be honest. We don't want to say that you can solve all of their problems, or say that you can, that there's nothing is ever going to hurt them again. So we kind of have to be honest about, maybe the situation that they're in, and maybe it's unclear what their future will hold, but still be reassuring and letting them know that you're there to help and that you're there to, stand by them as we move forward through the situation that they might be in. Next slide. And then, of course, setting that example, we are differentiating ourselves from past caregivers, and we're also tuning in to them and trying to understand them and what's going on with them. But we're also going to help by being an example. And so we talked about that a little bit, right? Being that emotional container. When we ourselves are feeling stressed, when we ourselves are dealing with certain things, our little one is watching us. Our teenager is, maybe it doesn't really seem like it, but they are paying attention to you. And so being able to just remain calm when things get stressful, being able to be clear about, even when you're sharing with them your stressful situation, be clear and calm about it. And then just having those consistent reactions. Some of their past caregivers might have had more unpredictable reactions, right? They might, and so that may have caused them to be a little bit afraid and fearful because they weren't really sure how their caregiver was going to respond. So when we're consistent and we're calm and we're clear about situations that might bring ourselves stress, that can really put them at ease. And just be honest and genuine about things that come up for us. So we are not, again, we are not giving them the wrong idea, and they don't feel like we have, that we are, lying to them. And just let the child know that it's normal to feel different or mixed emotions. I think we already touched on this, but really just letting them know that even though we might be angry, we might also be sad, that that's completely normal and that's really okay to feel that way. And so whenever that happens to you and you're sharing that with your child, I'm upset, I'm disappointed, but I'm also a little grateful. So you might be sharing with them that it's normal to have those kinds of mixed emotions. So these are just ways in which we can set that example for them so that they know that it's possible to manage emotions and it's possible to have different types of behaviors than maybe the kinds of emotions and behaviors and that they are used to seeing expressed, right? And so setting that example of what's healthy, and that could take a little bit of work on our end, maybe through this brief presentation. We are seeing that there's some areas that we could work on ourselves. We may have gone through trauma ourselves and are working on ourselves, and that's completely okay. And so it's just learning to set a better example. And when we know better, we do better. And so giving ourselves that grace. And when we do mess up, being able to apologize to that young person and being able to say, I didn't express myself well in that moment, and apologizing to them for that so that they understand, right, that there are other ways that they can be expressing their emotions, and that it's okay when you mess up, that you make amends and you're able to move forward with that relationship, and that relationship can continue to be intact. So these are just some ways that might be helpful to young people. The next slide is a short story of a child named AM. And so I'm just gonna have us read that quickly, and then we have some questions about the story on the next screen. So we're going to use the knowledge that we've gained in this module to help us answer those questions about this story. So I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to read it. Okay. Go ahead and go to the next screen and have some questions up there for you all. And I'm actually going to put that story into the chat just so you can refer back to it as you're answering the questions. But let's start with question 1. Why did AM react the way she did? Now that we know a little bit about the cognitive triangle, why do you think she reacted how she did? Okay, so maybe her reaction to the rabbits may have been that she had some previous trauma around responsibilities. So she's kind of blaming herself for her rabbit dying, right? And she felt responsible for that. What did her foster? It became a normal defense mechanism. Absolutely. And what did the foster mother do right? Do you feel like her reaction to the child was the right reaction, or a positive one, a good one, a helpful one? Okay, she shared a similar experience that she had. Her foster mom showed her that it was okay to have the feelings that she had. And maybe it made AM feel that she was heard. And maybe that helped their relationship. So the foster mother, maybe this is an example of a foster mom validating the child's feelings and letting her know that she relates to how she feels. It could be an example of the foster mother showing empathy. And you don't have to give details, but just think about this for a minute. Have you ever experienced something similar with children? Maybe it's not children in your care, but maybe children that you work with. Have you ever experienced this where there was a child who was struggling with some emotions and you were able to be helpful? Philip says every day. So feel free to share any of that. You can come off mute too and just share any examples that you have, a story that you have of being able to help a child who maybe was having a rough time with their feelings, with some thoughts even, or maybe with some behaviors that they were having. Were you able to help them interrupt that cognitive triangle?
Well,
Love to
recently,
hear some examples. Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
recently in one of our peacemaking circles, sex abuse was disclosed. Our circles are made up of I and 4 peacemakers, and we sit with individual participants, and the participant shared that she had experienced sexual abuse, reported it to um, her her guardian. The guardian, for some reason, didn't believe her, and that kind of ended that. And so, being that I experienced that, and other participants in our circle have experienced similar situations, we are able to kind of share those, our own experiences, and also what that did was kind of lifted some weight off of her, but also she was scared to tell her other parent for whatever reason. But now we have a meeting set up so she can tell her other parent about this having happened to her, and so we might get some type of accountability or at least some healing from the situation now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Philip, for sharing that and for being there for her the way that you were and being able to help her. That is definitely a trauma that she's been through. And when she shared that experience with you, you were able to respond with care. So thank you so much for sharing that story. Does anybody else want to share? Either in chat or to unmute? Okay, Sarah shared in the chat. So she is experiencing some behaviors with a toddler who's having some meltdowns and tantrums. Yeah. And you're, just being able to help him with those. It's great that you're able to help him with those. I also have a toddler, so I can relate. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, most days I can help him calm down, but it takes a while. Also, like with his history, he has a mom that had used meth with him, so like I don't know if that had any impact like on his brain. Because when we had got him, he was like a year old, but it's like he just has major meltdowns. I mean, and we try to calm and soothe him, but it's like sometimes we just have to like let him sit there and then like not bother him, and then he'll come out of it. But yeah, it's been a challenging experience because I think this meth has really impacted these children. So I'm kind of learning how to respond like in ways that can help him, because it's a journey.
Yeah, yeah. I do feel I relate to your situation. I also have a 1-year-old in a similar situation. So I love your commitments, and sometimes there isn't a straight answer of like, especially during those meltdowns. And you never know when the meltdowns are going to happen, right? And so I appreciate that you have given him some space, but you haven't given up on him, and you're still trying to be present and supportive of him. So thank you, Sarah, for doing that and making that kind of a difference in that child's life. Any other stories that people want to share? Oh, there was an altercation between two kids. Yamel, is that how you pronounce your name? Is sharing that story in the chat. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, that is the end of our presentation. This module 5 is actually a little longer than this, but like Shannon said, we're just giving you a taste of what is in these different modules. But this one focused on dealing with emotions and behaviors. So I hope that what you heard today was helpful to you, and definitely let us know if you work with resource parents and you're interested in bringing this resource to them. We would love to hear from you, or even visit a little bit more about the curriculum. So please feel free to reach out to us. Next slide. And then Antonia, I think we're at the end, the slide at the end. All right, thank you. So we just want to thank you all. I don't know, Shannon, do you have any closing words before we finish up?
No, not really. I just know that in our communities we have more and more people who are being asked to step up and be in caretaker roles, and just how important. The other thing that happens within the parent resource curriculum is a lot of times that curriculum is given to a group of parents, right? And what happens is not just what happens in the classroom, but what often happens is kind of that peer-to-peer support. It's always easier to talk to somebody who's actually experiencing similar things as you are. So that's another component of the parent resource curriculum. So, and we want to remind people that that they still need to complete the evaluation before we leave each other. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. And we do have an evaluation on the screen. I'll go ahead and pass it back over to Antonia. She can let us know about it.
Hello, everyone. Please complete the evaluation before you leave. This really helps us with future OLEs and online learning events. So your feedback is very much appreciated. And thank you all for joining. Have a great day.